Welcome to Thryx, a place where stories are not just told, they are felt. I am the Raven, and I bring you stories that explore mystery, fear, and the darkest corners of the human mind. Because fear does not begin in the dark, it begins within us. Every story on Thryx is more than horror. It is a psychological journey into trauma, obsession, and the choices fear forces us to make. So ask yourself, is the real danger outside, or is it what fear does to us from within? If you're ready to uncover the truth hidden in the shadows, let's begin. King Aldrich the Conqueror had burned 7 villages before he reached the cottage in the Blackwood Forest. His soldiers said the witch who lived there had cursed the land with plague and madness. They said she drank children's tears and wove nightmares from moonlight. They said many things, and Aldrich believed them all because believing made the burning easier. But when his men kicked down her door, they found only an old woman tending herbs by the fire. "I've harmed no one," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. Her hands were gnarled with age, her face lined like ancient bark. "The sickness came from your own wells, poisoned by your copper mines. The madness comes from guilt you refuse to name." "Silence, witch," Aldrich commanded, though something in her calm unsettled him. He'd expected screaming, pleading, or cursing, not this terrible tranquility. She finally looked at him, and her eyes held a sadness that made him want to turn away. "You've already decided my fate, young king. But know this, the curse you fear from me is nothing compared to the one you place upon yourself." "You admit your witchcraft, then?" "I admit only that I see clearly. And I see a man drowning in his own reflection." Before Aldrich could respond, she reached into the fire, her hand entering the flames without flinching, and withdrew a mirror. Its surface was black as midnight water, its frame twisted silver that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. "A gift," she said, "for the king who has everything but truth." Aldrich's captain stepped forward, but the king raised his hand. Some morbid curiosity made him reach for the mirror, and the moment his fingers touched it, the witch spoke her last words. "Look into it each night, your majesty. See what you've become. And when you can no longer bear the sight, when the reflection drives you to madness, remember that I offered you mercy, and you chose flames. They burned her anyway." Aldrich told himself it was necessary, that witches must die, that the law was clear. But that night, alone in his tent while his men celebrated their victory, he found himself holding the mirror. "Don't look," some instinct warned. "Throw it away, bury it." But kings do not show fear even to themselves. He looked. His reflection stared back, except it wasn't quite him. The face was his, the crown was his, but the eyes held an expression he'd never seen in his own face. Not anger or pride or determination. Something worse. Something hollow. The reflection smiled, and Aldrich did not. He dropped the mirror, heart hammering. It landed face down on his cot, unbroken. For a long moment he stared at it, then convinced himself he'd imagined the discord. Exhaustion. The stress of campaign. Nothing more. But he kept the mirror. Over the following weeks, as his army returned to the capital in triumph, Aldrich found himself compelled to look into it each night. The reflection became increasingly strange. Sometimes it moved moments before he did, Sometimes it didn't move at all, just watched him with growing contempt. Once he was certain he saw the reflection weep, while his own eyes remained dry. He told no one. Kings do not speak of such things. Kings do not admit to fear. The nightmares began in his 3rd week home. He dreamed of the witch burning, but in the dreams her face kept changing, becoming his mother, his childhood tutor, his first love. And always, just before he woke, she would turn to him with eyes full of flames and whisper, "See what you've become." His advisors noticed the change in him. The quick decisions became hesitant. The confident commands wavered. He started seeing threats everywhere, in servants' glances, in courtiers' smiles, and shadows that moved wrong. He increased the guards, demanded food tasters, began sleeping with a dagger under his pillow. "Your Majesty seems troubled," his chancellor ventured during one council meeting. "I am surrounded by vipers," Aldrich snapped, though he knew even as he spoke that the real viper was the voice in his own head, the one that whispered constantly now, "You are not safe. You are not good. You are not worthy of this crown." The mirror's reflection grew more distorted each night. It showed him things he didn't want to see. The burned villages, the faces of those he'd ordered killed, the children orphaned by his campaigns. But worse than the images was the feeling the mirror evoked. A creeping certainty that he was not the hero of his own story, but its villain. He tried to destroy it once, hurling it against the stone floor with all his strength. It didn't shatter, didn't even crack. It simply lay there, waiting. "This is madness," he thought. "The witch has cursed me. This is her revenge." But a quieter voice whispered, "Or she simply gave you what you needed, a way to see yourself as you truly are." He began avoiding mirrors altogether, covering the ones in his chambers, walking past reflective surfaces with his eyes averted. But it didn't help. The visions came anyway, uninvited. He would see his reflection in wine goblets, in polished armor, in the horrified eyes of his servants as his paranoia manifested in accusations and rage. His wife, Queen Elise, finally confronted him on a cold November night. "Aldrich, what's happening to you? You've become someone I don't recognize." "You wouldn't understand," he said, unable to meet her eyes. "Then help me understand. Let me in. Whatever burden you're carrying—" "There is no burden," he shouted and saw her flinch. Saw, too, his reflection in her frightened eyes, a tyrant, not a king. A monster wearing a crown. That night he looked into the witch's mirror and finally saw the complete truth. The reflection showed him not some demonic version of himself, but simply himself, as he actually was. A man who had justified cruelty as strength, who had called his fear caution and his guilt righteousness, who had burned an innocent woman because admitting she might be right was more terrifying than any curse. The horror wasn't that the mirror was enchanted. The horror was that it showed the truth he'd been fleeing for years, that he was neither the hero he pretended to be, nor the monster he feared becoming. He was simply a man who had committed terrible acts and wrapped them in noble words, who had built a kingdom on graves and called it glory. And the worst part, the truly unbearable part, was knowing that the witch had known. She'd seen this fear in him from the beginning, the terror of being seen clearly, of having his self-deceptions stripped away. So she'd given him the one thing he couldn't escape, his own reflection. Aldrich fell to his knees, the crown tumbling from his head. He wept for the first time since childhood, great wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. He wept for the villages, for the innocent condemned, for the man he might have been if he'd had the courage to look honestly at himself years ago. But this breaking, terrible as it was, brought an unexpected clarity. In that moment of complete surrender, Aldrich understood something his father had never taught him. True strength wasn't in denying fear or weakness, but in acknowledging them. The witch hadn't cursed him. She'd offered him a gift he'd been too proud to accept. The mirror forced him to confront what he'd been hiding from himself, and yes, it had driven him to the edge of madness. But on that edge, he'd finally found truth. He thought of his father, King Aldrich the Elder, who had died raving in his bed, convinced that assassins lurked in every shadow. His grandfather, too, had descended into paranoia, executing advisors and family alike in his final years. The histories called it the curse of the crown. But now Aldrich saw it differently. It wasn't a curse. It was the accumulated weight of unexamined conscience, of guilt never acknowledged, of fear turned inward and festering. His father and grandfather hadn't been cursed by witches. They'd been destroyed by their own refusal to face what they had done, by the psychological burden of atrocities committed and never confronted. Men who accumulate power through cruelty often end the same way, Aldrich realized. Not brought down by external enemies, but by the internal enemies they create. The paranoia, the anxiety, the erosion of trust and empathy. These weren't supernatural curses, but the natural consequences of living a lie, of constructing a false self that requires constant defense and can never truly rest. The mirror had simply accelerated what would have happened anyway. It had forced him to see, in months, what might have taken years of gradual decay. And in that forced confrontation, it had given him something his ancestors never had, a chance to change course before it was too late. Aldrich picked up the mirror one final time. His reflection no longer frightened him. It showed a broken man, yes, but one who was finally, painfully beginning to see clearly. The next morning, King Aldrich the Conqueror made several announcements that shocked his court. He commissioned an investigation into the copper mining practices. He established reparations for the families of those killed in the Blackwood campaign. He released prisoners held on dubious charges. He began meeting regularly with a traveling scholar who specialized in what he called the ailments of the mind. Someone who could help him understand the psychological patterns he'd fallen into, the trauma he'd both experienced and inflicted. Most controversially, he ordered a memorial built in the Blackwood forest with an inscription that read, "Here lived a woman who spoke truth to power. In burning her, we burned our own humanity. May we learn to listen before we destroy." The court whispered that he'd gone mad. Some plotted rebellion. But Aldrich no longer made decisions based on how others perceived his strength. He made them based on what he saw in the mirror each night. Not the witch's mirror, which he'd finally buried in the garden, but the ordinary mirror in his chambers that showed him simply whether he could bear to look himself in the eye. The change wasn't easy or complete. Aldrich still struggled with paranoia, still felt the weight of his guilt, still had nights when the nightmares returned and he woke gasping. But he'd learned to sit with these feelings instead of drowning them in denial or projecting them onto others. He'd learned that acknowledging weakness was different from being weak, that asking for help was different from being helpless. He'd learned that the real curse wasn't in being forced to see yourself clearly. It was in spending your life running from that sight until the running destroyed you from within. Years later, when Aldrich's own son came of age, the old king took him to the memorial in Blackwood Forest. "There was a woman here once," he said, "who tried to save me from myself. I was too proud to listen. Don't make my mistake." "What mistake, father?" "Thinking that strength means never admitting you're wrong, never facing what you've done, never accepting that you need help to process the weight of your own actions." He put his hand on his son's shoulder. "The mind can be haunted worse than any house, my boy. The ghosts we create from our own guilt and fear are more terrifying than any witch's curse. But they can be faced. They must be faced, or they'll destroy you as they nearly destroyed me." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment Aldrich could have sworn he heard a voice, old, sad, and strangely kind, whisper, "Well learned young king, well learned at last." Reflection. The deepest psychological horror comes not from external curses, but from internal ones. The stories we tell ourselves to justify our actions, the guilt we refuse to acknowledge, the reflection we cannot bear to see. Men who wield power without examining their conscience often descend into paranoia and madness, not because they are cursed, but because unprocessed trauma, unacknowledged guilt, and defended cruelty create psychological prisons from which there is no escape. The path out requires brutal honesty, looking at ourselves clearly, accepting our capacity for harm, and seeking help to process what we've done and become. The mirror always shows the truth. The question is whether we have the courage to look and the wisdom to change what we see. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this mysterious journey, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. For more thrilling and thought-provoking stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave,